The morning air in Quincy, Illinois, carried a peculiar stillness. It wasn't the usual winter hush, nor was it the kind of quiet that settled over the town in the early hours before life stirred awake. This silence was unnatural, almost too quiet, as if the world had paused in anticipation of something yet to be discovered. Kara Wilson knew something was wrong the moment she pulled into the driveway of her best friend's house. The front porch light was still on, even though the sun had started creeping over the horizon. Rebecca never forgot to turn it off, a small, seemingly insignificant detail, but to Kara, it was the first crack in a perfect image, the first whisper that something wasn't right. She stepped out of her car, gripping her phone tightly, the early morning chill sending a shiver down her spine. Rebecca was never late. They had planned this morning jog like they always did on weekends, but 15 minutes had passed, and her texts had gone unread. Calls rang through to voicemail. Rebecca was a creature of habit, a nurse, a mother, a woman who thrived on structure. If she wasn't answering, there had to be a reason, and Kara could feel it in her bones. Something was very, very wrong. She hesitated at the doorstep, knocking twice, then a third time, louder. Silence. She peered through the window beside the door, hoping for some sign of movement inside. The curtains were drawn, the house seemingly undisturbed. Then she tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. A part of her knew she should wait. Call someone first, but an even louder voice in her head pushed her forward, made her need to step inside. The air inside was thick, stagnant. The first thing she noticed was the untouched coffee mug on the kitchen counter. It still had steam rising from it. The second was Rebecca's phone, face down on the table, as if it had been abandoned mid-use. Then the scent hit her. It was faint but unmistakable, metallic. A sickening wave of nausea rolled over Kara as her eyes trailed toward the hallway, leading to Rebecca's bedroom. A part of her wanted to run, to leave, to call the police and pretend she hadn't set foot in here. But her feet were moving before she could stop them. Then she saw it, a shape on the floor. Rebecca. Blood, so much blood. A strangled gasp tore from Kara's throat as she stumbled backward, hand flying to her mouth. Her best friend lay motionless, her body crumpled awkwardly, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if frozen in the last moment of terror. Kara's mind screamed at her to move, but her body refused. This couldn't be real. This wasn't happening. It was a nightmare. It had to be. She fumbled for her phone, fingers trembling violently as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Her breath hitched. The words refused to form. Ma'am? Hello? Kara squeezed her eyes shut. This wasn't how the morning was supposed to go. They were supposed to be running at the park, gossiping about work, laughing about something ridiculous. Not this. Not this. Finally, the words tore out of her throat like a broken whisper. It's Rebecca. She's dead. The flashing red and blue lights carved through the early morning gloom, their reflections bouncing off the rain-slicked pavement. The distant wail of sirens had long since faded, replaced now by the quiet hum of police radios and the shuffling of officers as they moved methodically through the crime scene. The house, so ordinary, so lived in, was now something else entirely. A stage for violence. A place where a woman had taken her last breath under circumstances that no one yet understood. Detective Michael Donovan stood just outside the yellow police tape, eyes fixed on the front door. He had seen plenty of crime scenes before, each one carrying its own weight, its own story. But there was something about this one, a sense of unease that clung to the air like a fog that refused to lift. Rebecca Bliefnick was not just another statistic. She was a mother, a nurse, a woman who had, by all accounts, been full of life only hours ago. Now she was a lifeless body in a house that no longer felt like a home. The first responders had been quick to act, securing the scene, documenting evidence, but nothing about this felt rushed. Death demanded patience. It required an understanding of the details, the subtle imprints left behind by the one who had perished and the one who had made it happen. Inside, the forensic team moved with precision, cameras flashing as they captured every angle of the body. Rebecca lay on her back, her limbs splayed unnaturally. Her eyes, still open, reflected the harsh overhead light. There were multiple gunshot wounds, the blood pooling beneath her, having already begun to dry, darkening into a stark contrast against the pale carpet fibers. The lack of forced entry stood out immediately. The front door had been unlocked when Kara Wilson arrived, but that didn't necessarily mean Rebecca had let her killer in willingly. A back door, a window. There were other possibilities. Yet nothing appeared disturbed. No shattered glass, no overturned furniture, no sign of a struggle. A quiet, efficient kill. The shell casings, small metallic remnants of violence, glinted under the examination lights. There were several, each one marked and bagged for analysis. The grouping of the shots suggested control, precision. Whoever had done this had not panicked. This wasn't random. This wasn't impulsive. In the kitchen, an untouched cup of coffee sat cooling on the counter. It told its own story, a moment interrupted. Whatever Rebecca had been doing that morning, she hadn't expected to die. The phone, still resting on the table where she had left it, had several unread messages. One from Kara, another from an unknown number. Donovan glanced at the forensic lead, who was bent over the body, taking note of the wound patterns. Close range, the examiner muttered, though the words weren't meant for conversation. No hesitation. She never had a chance. A murder like this didn't just happen. It was deliberate, intentional. Stepping away from the body, Donovan let his eyes roam the room, trying to piece together what had led to this moment. A home was more than just walls and furniture. It held secrets, whispers of the life once lived within it. And this home was whispering something unsettling. The forensic team moved on to the bedroom, where they found something that made everyone pause. A drawer, partially open, inside a manila folder, legal documents, divorce proceedings. The pages detailed the bitter unraveling of a marriage, the kind of legal battle that left wounds far deeper than anything visible. Custody agreements, financial disputes, testimonies filled with resentment. The forensic photographer snapped a shot of the folder before an officer carefully lifted it, slipping it into an evidence bag. It was too early to say whether these documents had anything to do with Rebecca's death, but Donovan had worked enough cases to know that domestic disputes often spilled over into something far worse. In the hallway, another officer knelt beside a security panel. It had been turned off, deliberately. Donovan exhaled, feeling the weight of the case beginning to settle over him. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose threads. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a dull glow over the crime scene. But inside, within these walls, the darkness remained. This was only the beginning. The police station was a stark contrast to the crime scene. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow on stacks of paperwork and scattered coffee cups. The air was thick with the scent of stale caffeine and something less tangible: tension. Detective Michael Donovan sat at his desk, sifting through the early findings of the investigation. It was still morning, but already the weight of the case pressed heavily on his shoulders. The murder of Rebecca Bliefnick wasn't just another homicide. It carried a sense of calculation, a deliberate act rooted in something deeper than impulse. Someone had wanted her dead, and they had made sure she never had the chance to fight back. The lack of forced entry suggested familiarity. The proximity of the gunshots spoke of intent, and now the divorce papers hinted at a motive. The coroner's preliminary report had come in. Multiple gunshot wounds. The fatal shot struck her chest, likely piercing her heart. No defensive wounds. She had been taken by surprise. The shots were clustered, indicating a controlled hand, someone who either knew how to shoot or had fired with a chilling level of determination. Then there was the security system, disabled. Not just turned off, but deliberately deactivated before the murder. That detail gnawed at Donovan. A random intruder wouldn't have done that. A burglar wouldn't have taken the time. Whoever did this knew Rebecca's home well enough to bypass her security. He glanced at the list of names the officers had gathered. Family, friends, colleagues, anyone who had interacted with Rebecca in the weeks leading up to her death. At the top of the list was Timothy Bliefnick, ex-husband, father of her children, and the man whose name appeared repeatedly in the divorce filings. Their separation hadn't been amicable. The custody battle had been ugly, stretching over months. Rebecca had filed court motions citing concerns for her safety, though there was no documented history of physical abuse. Just unease, a fear she had put into words but had never been able to prove. Donovan knew better than to make assumptions. A contentious divorce didn't automatically make a man a murderer, but it did raise questions. It provided a motive. And in homicides like this, motive was everything. He flipped to the next page of the report, a timeline reconstruction. The last confirmed sighting of Rebecca had been the previous evening, around 9:30 p.m. A neighbor recalled seeing her kitchen light on when they took their dog out. The estimated time of death, based on body temperature and rigor mortis, was between midnight and 2 a.m. That left a 3 to 4 hour window where someone had entered her home and ended her life. The security system log had recorded its last activity at 11:17 p.m., the exact moment it had been deactivated. That meant the killer had either turned it off themselves or had gained entry through someone who had access. Her phone records showed no outgoing calls or texts after 10 p.m. However, a call had come in from an unknown number at 11:42 p.m. It went unanswered. Whoever had tried to reach her that late at night was now a person of interest. Forensics had also retrieved gunshot residue from the body, but there was something strange. The initial tests indicated that the killer had used a suppressed firearm. The shots had been muffled. It explained why no one in the neighborhood had reported hearing gunfire. Someone had planned this. Someone had been careful. Yet even the most careful killers left traces of themselves behind. A knock on the door pulled Donovan from his thoughts. An officer entered, dropping a small sealed evidence bag onto his desk. Inside was a printed-out email, slightly crumpled at the edges. "Recovered from the victim's home," the officer said. "She never got the chance to send it." Donovan picked it up and read the first line. "If something happens to me, look at my ex-husband first." His pulse slowed. Rebecca had been afraid. She had left a warning. The question now was, had anyone listened in time? The air inside the Quincy Police Department felt heavier as the investigation pushed forward. Every crime had a rhythm, a sequence of events that led to its inevitable conclusion. Detective Michael Donovan had spent years reconstructing those sequences, piecing together the moments that transformed ordinary lives into headlines. But something about Rebecca Bliefnick's murder unsettled him in a way that other cases hadn't. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime. It was the premeditation, the quiet, methodical way in which it had been carried out. No forced entry, a security system disabled with purpose, a weapon fitted with a suppressor. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a plan. And the person who had executed that plan had left nothing to chance. The evidence table in the briefing room was slowly beginning to tell a story. The manila folder of divorce papers, now carefully bagged, painted a picture of a legal battle filled with hostility. The custody filings were recent. Rebecca had been fighting for sole custody of her children. Her emails and text messages, combed through by the forensic team, revealed more. There were exchanges with her attorney, detailing concerns about Timothy's behavior. He hadn't hit her. He hadn't threatened her outright, but his words carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. "He gets angry when he doesn't get his way. He makes me feel like I'm being watched. I don't trust what he's capable of." Donovan had seen this before. A slow, creeping fear that built over time. A victim who sensed danger before it arrived, but had no way of proving it. The digital forensics team had also uncovered something else. Rebecca had searched for self-defense courses weeks before her murder. She had looked up restraining orders, though she had never filed one. She had seen the storm coming, but she hadn't been able to stop it. The security system logs had confirmed what Donovan already suspected. The system had been manually disarmed at 11:17 p.m. Someone had known how to bypass it. The question was how. There was no sign of forced entry, no tampered wiring. Whoever had turned it off had either been inside or had known the code. That led to only two possibilities. Rebecca had let them in. They had known the house well enough to disable it without hesitation. Both possibilities pointed in the same direction. Then there was the phone call at 11:42 p.m. An unknown number, unanswered. The tech team was working to trace it, but Donovan already had a feeling that it wasn't random. Every detail, every inconsistency was pushing him toward the same inevitable conclusion. But knowing something and proving it were two very different things. The forensic team had gone over Rebecca's home with meticulous care. The shell casings had been collected, fingerprints dusted and analyzed, yet so far nothing had tied the crime to a specific individual. The killer had been careful, almost too careful. The problem with a crime this controlled was that it lacked chaos, and sometimes chaos was what led to mistakes. It wasn't until the forensic team examined the back door that they found something unusual. A faint smudge near the handle, barely visible, almost an afterthought. It wasn't a full fingerprint, but it was something. A partial print, smeared as if someone had tried to wipe it clean, but had failed to remove it entirely. It was small, deliberate, and it wasn't Rebecca's. The lab was already processing it. If it came back as a match, it could be the first solid lead that pointed toward the killer. Donovan leaned back in his chair, staring at the case files spread before him. The crime scene had spoken. Now it was a matter of deciphering what it was trying to say. Outside the station, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the pavement. But inside these walls, where Rebecca's case was being dissected piece by piece, the darkness remained. And somewhere out there, a killer was watching, waiting, wondering if they had left something behind. The Quincy Police Department was quieter than usual, though the weight of the investigation loomed heavy in the air. Homicide cases always carried a certain intensity, but this one felt different. It was not the senseless act of a desperate criminal or a chaotic outburst of violence. This was something else entirely, calculated, precise, and chillingly methodical. Detective Michael Donovan sat at his desk, sifting through the latest forensic reports. Each new piece of information was like a thread in a tangled web, leading somewhere but still frustratingly disconnected. The evidence was beginning to speak, but its message was not yet complete. The partial fingerprint found on the back door handle had been a turning point. It was not a full match, but it was distinct enough to be compared against known suspects. That meant that once they had the right person in their sights, they could confirm whether or not they had been in Rebecca's home that night. Then there was the matter of the security system. The system had been manually disarmed at exactly 11:17 p.m., something that could only be done by someone with access to the house or knowledge of the code. Yet there was no evidence that Rebecca had willingly let anyone inside that night. If she had, there should have been some trace of communication, some record of an expected visitor. But there was nothing. Not a single call, not a single text, except one, the burner phone. The forensic analysis of Rebecca's phone had revealed an unanswered call at 11:42 p.m. from an unregistered number, a disposable device, impossible to trace to a specific person. Someone had called her that night, someone who didn't want their identity known. This was no coincidence. Every detail pointed to premeditation, to an individual who had planned every move and ensured that there would be no obvious trail leading back to them. And yet, despite this effort to erase all traces of their involvement, they had left behind something. The ballistics team had finalized their report on the bullets recovered from the crime scene. The gun used to kill Rebecca was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, a common firearm, but one that could be traced if they found the weapon. This was where cases either stalled or broke wide open. Killers who acted impulsively often panicked and discarded the weapon in a way that made it easy to find. But this crime had not been committed in haste. The gun was likely hidden, possibly even still in the possession of the killer. If they could locate it, if they could match it to the crime, then all the careful planning in the world wouldn't matter. The investigation was narrowing. The evidence was closing in, slowly tightening the circle around a single name, one that had been present since the very beginning, Timothy Bliefnick. His name was all over the divorce filings, the custody battle, the legal battles that had consumed the last year of Rebecca's life. The tension between them had been palpable, bitter, unresolved. Rebecca had voiced concerns about him. She had sent an email warning that if anything happened to her, he should be the first person investigated. And now every detail was pointing in his direction. But suspicion was not the same as proof. Donovan had worked too many cases to fall into the trap of assumptions. They needed something concrete, a definitive link. The fingerprint, the burner phone, and the murder weapon were all breadcrumbs leading toward the truth, but they weren't enough to make an arrest. Not yet. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on his door. One of the forensic techs stepped inside, holding a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a single spent shell casing, recovered from a different location, a shooting range where Timothy Bliefnick had practiced just weeks earlier. If the ballistic markings matched the bullets retrieved from Rebecca's body, then the case would shift dramatically. Donovan exhaled slowly, feeling the momentum shift. The cracks in the perfect crime were starting to form. And once they did, it was only a matter of time before the whole thing collapsed. The weight of the case pressed against the walls of the Quincy Police Department, a silent presence that settled over every investigator involved. It had been days since the murder of Rebecca Bliefnick, and yet the scene remained vivid in Detective Michael Donovan's mind. The stillness of the house, the blood pooling beneath her body, the untouched coffee mug on the counter, a moment of normalcy frozen in time before everything had gone horribly wrong. The investigation was no longer a question of who. It was a question of how to prove it. There were cracks in the killer's carefully crafted plan, but no single piece of evidence was enough to lock the case into place. The partial fingerprint on the back door, the deactivated security system, the burner phone, all suspicious, all suggestive, but none definitive. The shell casing found at the shooting range was promising, but until ballistics confirmed a match, it was only another piece of a puzzle that wasn't quite complete. Still, the walls were closing in. The forensic team was working methodically, analyzing data from Rebecca's home security system. Though the system had been deactivated before the murder, its logs still existed. There had been no forced entry, no tripped alarms, but a manual disarm at 11:17 p.m. That meant either Rebecca had let someone in willingly, or the person responsible knew exactly how to bypass the system. That kind of access wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was planned. The timing was deliberate. Whoever had done this had waited for the right moment. Not too early when Rebecca might still have been awake, but not so late that the neighborhood would have been completely silent, increasing the risk of detection. Then there was the call from the burner phone at 11:42 p.m. It had been one last attempt at control, one final moment where the killer had either tried to confirm something or wanted to hear the silence on the other end. Psychological patterns mattered in investigations like this. Donovan had seen it before. The need for control, the desire to erase any possibility of resistance. The way this crime had been committed pointed towards someone who had wanted Rebecca gone, but also wanted to ensure it was done without error. That kind of precision was chilling. And yet, even the most carefully executed crimes had flaws. The forensic team had recovered gunshot residue from Rebecca's wounds, confirming that the shots had been fired from a suppressed weapon. That explained why no neighbors had heard gunfire, why the murder had occurred in near silence. Suppressors weren't uncommon, but they weren't standard either. The presence of one suggested premeditation on another level. The team had already begun cross-referencing recent firearm purchases and registrations in the area. They weren't expecting to find a direct purchase under Timothy Bliefnick's name. He wouldn't have been that careless. But maybe he had borrowed one. Maybe someone had sold it to him off record. Maybe somewhere there was a transaction, a piece of surveillance footage, a message that connected him to a weapon that was now tied to a murder. If they could find that link, the game would change. Meanwhile, another detail had surfaced, one that spoke louder than words. Rebecca had received a text message 2 days before her death from a blocked number. It had been brief. "This ends soon." There had been no response from Rebecca. No one had seen it until now, but now it was the beginning of something else. It was a warning. It was a mistake. The walls weren't just closing in on the killer anymore. They were about to collapse. The case against Rebecca Bliefnick's killer was taking shape, not as a single revelation, but as a slow, methodical tightening of a noose. Detective Michael Donovan had worked enough cases to know that solving a murder was rarely about dramatic confessions or smoking guns. Instead, it was about the accumulation of small, unavoidable truths, a sequence of details, each insignificant on its own, but together forming an undeniable picture. And that picture was becoming clearer. The forensic lab had confirmed that the shell casing recovered from the shooting range matched the ballistic markings on the bullets extracted from Rebecca's body. It was a breakthrough, but not yet a conviction. A casing alone didn't tie anyone to the trigger. It only proved that a specific gun had been used in both locations. But then there was the partial fingerprint, still awaiting a direct match. It was an imperfect clue, but also a rare one, because the killer had been careful, almost obsessively so. No other fingerprints had been found on the door handle or anywhere suspicious in the house. The security system logs reinforced what Donovan already suspected. The system had been disabled manually, meaning Rebecca had either let her killer in or the person had known exactly how to gain entry without force. That meant familiarity. That meant access. And the text message from the block number. This ends soon. That was not a threat made in the heat of the moment. It was a promise, a final warning, and Rebecca had ignored it. Her past decisions were coming into focus now. She had known something was wrong. She had sensed it, feared it, and tried to prepare for it. The searches for self-defense classes, the inquiries about restraining orders, the unsent email naming her ex-husband, each was a piece of her growing desperation, a woman trying to protect herself from something she couldn't prove was coming. Until it did. Donovan flipped through the financial records, bank statements, credit card purchases, anything that might hint at unusual activity from Timothy Bliefnick. It was easy to miss the small withdrawals, spaced out over time, always under the threshold that would raise suspicion. But when placed together, they painted a pattern. Consistent cash withdrawals in the months leading up to the murder. Someone preparing. Someone needing untraceable funds. The background check on Timothy had also revealed a recent firearm training course he had attended, one that focused on concealment techniques and shooting with suppressors. He had been learning how to do this. He had been practicing, but still, there was no direct evidence tying him to the crime. That was the problem with premeditated murders. The killer had time to think, to erase mistakes, to leave behind as little as possible. But the one thing they could never erase was their own mind. The decisions they made before and after the crime, the behaviors that shifted when they thought no one was watching. And Timothy Bliefnick had begun to shift. Surveillance had been placed on him, quiet but persistent. Officers had noted a change in routine. He was more cautious, avoiding his usual habits. He wasn't reckless or panicked, but aware. Like a man waiting, like a man watching the walls close in. The tech team was still working to trace the burner phone, but disposable numbers didn't leave much of a trail. The call at 11:42 p.m. on the night of the murder remained a gaping hole in the timeline, but that was about to change. One of the analysts had flagged an anomaly in the local cell tower logs. The burner phone had been used near Rebecca's home, but not for the first time. It had also pinged from a location near Timothy's residence 2 weeks prior. A mistake, a slip in an otherwise careful plan. Now they had movement. They had proof that the person who called Rebecca on the night of her murder had also been near Timothy's home before. The trap was closing, and soon there would be no way out. The weight of the investigation was shifting, no longer scattered in a dozen directions, but funneling toward a single inevitability. The pieces were coming together, slow but steady, like a tide creeping in, unstoppable, methodical, and merciless in its approach. Detective Michael Donovan had spent years following trails just like this one, where a killer believed they had outthought the system, covered every trace, left behind nothing that could tether them to the crime. But no one ever left nothing. Somewhere hidden between the details was the mistake, the slip that would undo everything. And as the days passed, that mistake was beginning to show itself. The burner phone had been the first fracture in an otherwise meticulous plan. It had been used twice before the night of Rebecca's murder, once near her home and once near Timothy Bliefnick's residence. That meant the person who had used it had been in both locations at key points leading up to the crime. Now the forensic team was breaking down the timeline further, combing through surveillance footage from businesses near both locations, looking for any car, any figure, anything that might connect those movements to a person. Then there was the matter of the gun. The ballistics report had been finalized. The bullets extracted from Rebecca's body were an exact match to the ones recovered from a spent shell casing at the shooting range Timothy had visited weeks earlier. That meant the gun hadn't been borrowed, hadn't been some random, unregistered weapon floating in the streets. It had been fired before in a place that Timothy had been known to visit. Still, they didn't have the gun itself. And until they did, there would always be room for denial, for doubt, for the possibility of an alternate explanation. Killers who planned their crimes this carefully didn't make it easy to find the murder weapon. It was likely buried, destroyed, thrown into a body of water. But even the act of hiding it was a clue. Where had Timothy been in the days following Rebecca's death? Did he take a drive to a remote location? Had he changed his usual routine? The surveillance on him was still active, and the officers tracking him had noticed something strange. He wasn't acting like a man who thought he had gotten away with murder. There was no reckless confidence, no false sense of security. Instead, he had grown careful, paranoid, hyper-aware of his surroundings. He was looking over his shoulder. He was taking different routes to places he frequented. He had even begun to avoid his own home, spending more time elsewhere. People who were innocent didn't act like that. Then came the final piece of evidence that tilted everything forward. Financial records had already hinted at something strange, a pattern of small withdrawals, spread out over time, just below the threshold that would raise suspicion. That alone could mean many things, but now a transaction had surfaced that stood out. 2 months before Rebecca's murder, a cash purchase had been made at a sporting goods store for a suppressor-compatible firearm. The store had no direct record of the buyer, as Illinois law did not require registration for private sales of suppressors, but security cameras had recorded the sale, and the footage was being pulled now. If that footage placed Timothy at the store, if he had bought the gun that had fired the rounds that killed Rebecca, then all the careful planning in the world wouldn't matter. The mask would break, and when it did, there would be nothing left for him to hide behind. The weight of the investigation had shifted. The pieces that once felt disconnected were now forming an undeniable picture. The case against Timothy Bliefnick was no longer a matter of suspicion or theory. It was taking the shape of certainty, a series of deliberate actions that pointed to only one person. Detective Michael Donovan had spent his career tracking killers who thought they had perfected the art of getting away with murder. They covered their tracks, planned their alibis, erased the obvious mistakes. But they always left something behind, and Timothy had left behind too many somethings. The burner phone, once thought to be untraceable, had betrayed him. It had connected his world to Rebecca's, placing him near her home before the murder and again at his own residence weeks before. The financial records showed a slow, calculated plan with withdrawals small enough to avoid detection, yet consistent enough to suggest he had been preparing for something. The firearm purchase had been a damning revelation. Security footage had now confirmed his presence at the sporting goods store 2 months before the murder. The store clerk had no memory of him, just another faceless customer among many. But the transaction was clear: a cash purchase, unregistered, a weapon compatible with the suppressor used in the crime. That alone wasn't enough for an arrest. Owning a gun wasn't a crime, but the ballistics report had shattered any hope of ambiguity. The bullets that ended Rebecca's life had come from the same model purchased in that store, and now they just needed to prove that the gun he had fired at the shooting range was the same gun used in the murder. Then there was his behavior. Timothy Bliefnick wasn't a man who had just lost his ex-wife to an act of random violence. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't angry. He was watching. The officers tailing him had noticed the changes in his patterns, his sudden avoidance of his usual routines, the careful glances over his shoulder, the restless way he moved from place to place. He wasn't running, but he wasn't comfortable either. He was waiting for the moment everything collapsed. The final piece of the puzzle had come from Rebecca herself, her text messages, her emails, the unsent draft that named him. They painted a portrait of a woman who had seen the danger coming, but had no way to stop it. She had tried to protect herself. She had tried to warn those around her, and now those warnings had become her last words. The case was complete. There was no more doubt, no more questions, no more speculation. There was only the truth, and the truth was about to catch up to Timothy Bliefnick. The weight of the investigation had become suffocating. The evidence, once scattered fragments, had formed an inescapable truth. Rebecca Bliefnick had not been the victim of chance, nor of senseless violence. She had been hunted, stalked, executed. and the man responsible had planned every moment of it. The arrest was inevitable. Timothy Bliefnick had spent weeks walking freely, unaware that the walls around him had been closing in. The officers trailing him had noted every change in his behavior, every attempt to outmaneuver a force he could not escape. He had become more erratic, careful in ways that only the guilty ever were, avoiding familiar places, taking routes that made no logical sense, pausing at intersections as though trying to decide if he was being followed. But paranoia was not enough to save him. The evidence had done its job. The burner phone, once a ghost, had left traces where it should not have. The financial withdrawals, subtle and deliberate, had painted a pattern of preparation. The gun, its presence once a question, had been traced back to him through surveillance footage, its bullets a perfect match to those that had ended Rebecca's life. And then there was the final betrayal. Technology did not forget. The forensic analysts had combed through his search history, his messages, the digital footprints that even the most careful criminals failed to erase. There, among countless mundane searches, was the confirmation they needed. How to break into a house without leaving evidence. Best way to dispose of a gun after a crime. How long does gunshot residue stay on skin? A man who was innocent did not need to ask such questions. A man who had nothing to hide did not prepare for what would happen after he pulled the trigger. And so, the moment came. It was early morning when the officers surrounded his house. The quiet suburban street bathed in the red and blue lights of squad cars. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, awakened by the disturbance, but not yet understanding that they were witnessing the moment a killer was brought to justice. The knock on the door was firm, unrelenting. Inside there was a delay, a hesitation, a final moment of freedom before the world changed forever. Then the door opened. Timothy Bliefnick stood there, his face unreadable. But Donovan had seen this expression before. It was the look of a man who knew there was no way out. The cuffs locked around his wrists with finality. He was no longer a suspect, no longer a man who might have done something. He was a killer, caught at last. And as he was led away, the weight of what he had done settled into the silence he left behind. The courtroom carried an air of cold finality. It was a space where stories were unraveled, where the weight of guilt or innocence was measured by the precision of words, the depth of evidence, the unshakable truths that could not be buried beneath deception. The people seated in the gallery whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible over the hum of anticipation. They were not here for entertainment. They were here to witness the slow, meticulous dismantling of a man who had tried to erase a life. Timothy Bliefnick had spent his days behind bars waiting for this moment. His defense team had attempted to stall proceedings, arguing technicalities, questioning evidence, trying to create fractures in a case that had been built with relentless precision. But there were no fractures. There were only facts. Rebecca Bliefnick had not died at random. She had not been the victim of coincidence. She had been hunted, silenced, and stolen from the world by a man who had once claimed to love her. The prosecution began by establishing the timeline of events, laying bare the methodical nature of the crime. The court heard about the security system, deactivated at 11:17 p.m., a deliberate action performed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The evidence showed that Rebecca had not turned it off herself. The jury was shown the forensic analysis of the burner phone, the digital footprint that placed it near her home on more than one occasion. The prosecution revealed the damning fact that it had also pinged near Timothy Bliefnick's home weeks before the murder. Then came the ballistics report. The bullets extracted from Rebecca's body were compared to those fired at a shooting range weeks earlier. The exact same type, the exact same weapon. The same gun that had been traced back to a cash purchase Timothy had made months before the crime. It was not an accident. It was an execution. The financial records painted an even clearer picture. Timothy had been pulling out small amounts of cash over time, staying below the threshold that would raise suspicion. The withdrawals had started long before Rebecca's death, proving that he had been preparing for this crime well in advance. Then the prosecution presented the most chilling evidence of all, his search history. Displayed on the screen before the jury were the searches he had typed into his computer, each one a whisper of his guilt before the act had even been committed. How to break into a house without leaving evidence. How to kill someone and not get caught. How long does gunshot residue stay on skin? The courtroom was silent. There was no misinterpretation of these searches, no justification that could frame them as anything other than premeditation. Timothy Bliefnick sat expressionless, his eyes fixed on the screen, as if seeing his own downfall written in front of him. He had planned this for weeks, months, believing he had thought of everything. But he had been wrong. The defense tried to fight back, attempted to poke holes where there were none. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had seen him pull the trigger, that there was still room for reasonable doubt. But the weight of the truth was too heavy to ignore. Rebecca had known. She had written it herself in messages to friends, in emails that had never been sent, in quiet admissions of fear that had been dismissed too easily. And now she was speaking from beyond the grave. The jury listened. The judge listened. The world listened. And when the verdict was read, there was no shock, no gasp of surprise. Guilty, on all counts. Timothy Bliefnick had spent months constructing his alibi, perfecting the murder he thought would go unsolved. But in the end, the evidence had done what it was always meant to do. It had buried him, and Rebecca, whose voice had been stolen from her that night, was finally heard. The verdict had been delivered. The trial was over. The evidence, the testimony, the inescapable truth, all of it had led to the moment when the gavel struck wood, sealing Timothy Bliefnick's fate. The word guilty had echoed through the courtroom, but there had been no celebration, no relief that could undo the loss that had brought everyone to this moment. Justice had been served, but justice was not the same as closure. Rebecca Bliefnick's family sat in the courtroom as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. The weight of her absence was palpable, a hollow space that could never be filled. They had watched the trial unfold, had listened as the prosecution peeled away the layers of deception, revealing the horrifying truth piece by piece. They had seen the forensic evidence, the security system logs, the gunshot residue reports, the financial transactions, the burner phone records, all of it painting a picture of a man who had not just killed, but had planned every second of the crime. And now he was paying for it. Timothy Bliefnick sat in silence as the judge read his sentence. Life in prison, no parole, no second chance. A fitting consequence for a man who had stolen Rebecca's future, who had torn apart the lives of their children, who had turned love into something dark, something fatal. Yet as the sentence was handed down, there was no satisfaction in the room. No punishment could bring Rebecca back. No years spent behind bars could erase what had been done. Her children would grow up without a mother. Her friends would never hear her laughter again. Her family would forever carry the burden of knowing she had seen this coming and no one had been able to stop it. There was no such thing as true closure. Outside the courthouse, the media gathered, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward in search of reactions. The story had captured the nation's attention. The tragic murder of a devoted mother, the brutal details of a crime committed not by a stranger, but by the man who had once stood beside her at the altar. The world had watched as the case unfolded, had followed every forensic breakthrough, had debated every legal argument. But for those who had loved Rebecca, this wasn't just a story. It was a wound that would never fully heal. Weeks passed, then months. The case faded from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new scandals, new stories that demanded attention. But in Quincy, Illinois, her absence remained. Her house was sold. Her belongings were packed away. But her presence lingered. The impact of her death stretched beyond a single act of violence. It had ignited a conversation about domestic abuse, about the unseen warning signs that too often went ignored, about the dangers of control disguised as love. A foundation was started in her name, one that provided resources for women who feared for their safety but didn't know where to turn. Rebecca had fought to protect herself. Now, even in death, she was protecting others. As for Timothy Bliefnick, his days were now spent behind cold steel bars, surrounded by walls that would never change, by time that would never pass quickly enough. The man who had spent months meticulously planning a murder had never planned for what came after. The world had moved on without him, and it always would. Rebecca's story had ended far too soon, but in the quiet moments, in the laughter of her children, in the lives she had touched, in the people who still spoke her name with love, she lived on. Justice had been served, but justice was never enough, because some losses could never be repaid. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.